Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the October 3rd, 2022 special meeting for the Troy City Council. I'll call the meeting to order and ask for the roll call from Ms. Dixon.
Mayor Baker?
Here.
Councilmember Abraham?
Here.
Councilmember Brooks?
Here.
Councilmember Chamberlain Krenda?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Erickson Galt?
Here.
Councilmember Hamilton?
Here.
Councilmember Hunter?
Here.
All present this evening. First up on the agenda is public comment. I don't see anybody here from the public for comment this evening, so we'll move on to business stated in the special meeting notice. We have one item this evening. D1 is a presentation on property values, tax rates, and taxes, and I will turn it over to Assistant City Manager Bob Bruner to get things started.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thanks City Council for meeting again for the special meeting. I think we're on number 4 now, and I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. This is all part of a process leading into the advance in November, really trying to educate the City Council and to the public to the extent that the public is watching at this point. Another important step on the road to the advance in November is going to be the survey results, which will be presented during tonight's regular meeting. So first meeting we talked about revenues, second meeting we talked about expenditures, third meeting we talked about revenues, expenditures, and fund balance. And tonight's presentation covers several different bases, a lot of it related to property tax base, tax rates, and the taxes people actually pay, and some questions that have come up along the way. So we have a lot of material to cover. So I won't dwell on very many of the slides very long. So understanding property taxes is difficult primarily because taxable value depends more on when a property was capped and uncapped, and that happens when it's sold or otherwise transferred, than how much the market says that property is worth. And it really helps to see some specific examples in order to understand that. Prior to this, I've spent a lot of time talking about averages, and I've acknowledged that, you know, there may not be an average Troy taxpayer. Everybody may be below the average, or half the people may be below, half the people may be above. So tonight you'll see some real examples. And you'll also see some more comparisons to these 8 communities, which I've used varying different communities for comparisons up to this point. But this group is really mathematically most similar to Troy in terms of tax base and population and taxable value per capita. Which is tough because Troy is the largest city in Oakland County with the largest tax base. So, you know, in a perfect world, you might see some communities that are bigger and some communities that are smaller, but there's really not many bigger communities for us to use as comparisons. So, imperfect as it is, that's what we've got. So, first of all, let's talk about property. There's more than one kind of property. There's 2 kinds of property. There's real property and personal property. Real property, you got agricultural, commercial, industrial, residential, timber cutover, and developmental. Thankfully, we don't have to talk about most of those. We don't have any agricultural property in Troy. We have commercial, industrial, and residential. So that's primarily what you're going to see. And then on personal property, I struck through agricultural and residential because we don't have those either. And they might not even exist statewide anymore. I can't remember with the personal property tax reform. But on the charts where you see personal property, you're just going to see total personal property, which is going to include commercial, industrial, and utility for simplicity's sake. The property values that we're going to talk about are primarily going to be taxable value, but these are definitions from the state. True cash value is the fair market value. SEV, state equalized value, is supposed to be half of that. Assessed value is supposed to be the same as SEV, except when it's not. And taxable value is the one that we're going to focus on because that's the value that people pay taxes on. Again, it's capped. It's uncapped and capped when a property is transferred, and then it can only increase by the lesser of the rate of inflation or 5%, whichever is less, and it's never been 5%. I think the most it's ever been up to now is something like 3.1. But that may change in the near future. So wanted to give you a little bit of a feel for Troy's tax base. So 2004 is on the left, 2012 is on the right. You can see that basically residential is what grew. The others were basically shrank a little bit. And that's not because physically the city of Troy changed. It's because that's what the values did during that 18-year period. We're going to look at this a couple different ways, but pick the one that makes most sense to you. This is the same information. Here you've got dollars and billions. This is a pie chart, so you can see as a percentage. Again, residential going from 55% of assessed value to 67% in 2021. This is, again, taxable value instead of assessed value. Value in billions, 2004 on the left, 2021 on the right. Same thing. The residential real component is the part that's growing, and the others actually shrank a little. And same information as a pie, taxable value, 2004 to 2012. So this is all the property in Troy, real and personal. The blue line is residential real property only, and orange is everything else. So everything that's non-residential. So you can see 1995 was the first year after Proposal A was implemented when taxable value first became a thing. So you can see for the first 5-6 years, Troy's residential and non-residential tax base were about equal. And then that starts to change as the non-residential taxable value levels off. I think this requires more research, but I think this has more to do with the way non-residential parcels are taxed. And there's a couple decisions at the Michigan Tax Tribunal that basically make it easier for non-residential taxpayers to appeal their taxes and lower their values than it does for residential taxpayers. So what this is showing us may reflect policy decisions that are being made at the state level as much or perhaps even more than what's happening in the real estate market in Troy. Regardless of why, you can see, here we are in 2022, we've got $2 billion in non-residential taxable value and $4 billion in residential. So in terms of the tax base, residential outnumbers non-residential 2-to-1. So when you have property, a taxable value that's limited by inflation and assessed value that is not, a gap can grow when property values are growing, and that gap is known as untaxed value. So this is the untaxed value on the left in 2004, residential real, commercial real, industrial real. There's no personal property that's untaxed. And then you can see in 2021, residential real has gone from $700 million to 1.1 billion. So that's the amount of value that's not being taxed because a parcel's taxable value is capped. And we'll talk about what happens at uncapping. Again, this is the untaxed value by property class. So you can see that on the right in 2021, this is primarily benefiting residential taxpayers and a little bit less commercial and industrial. All right, so this is the average residential property value in Troy from 2004 to 2022. So you see the blue is the taxable value and the orange is the untaxed value. So those two things together, the top of the column is the assessed value. So you can see what happened pre-recession. The untaxed value was growing and growing and growing, and I think it peaked at about 21%. And then during the recession basically wiped out that untaxed value. It pushed assessed values down, where on average there was just a 2% untaxable value during that time. And now in 2022, we're back to, we're at 22% now. So we're actually, the gap is bigger than it was before the recession. Yeah, okay, that's what I just said. 21% before the Great Recession, 2% during the Great Recession, now we're at 22%. So let's talk about some examples, and this is just the value. We'll talk about taxes in a minute. So this is a home that's been capped since 1994. So you can see that, like the average, the untaxed value rose in the early 2000s, was wiped away during the Great Recession, and is now increased again. And then you can see the lines on this graph show the average assessed value and average residential value. So again, this property taxpayer is a little bit above the average. This property taxpayer is a little bit below the average. But again, you see the same pattern of that untaxed value growing before the recession, getting wiped out during the recession, and then growing again. So neither one of these homes has been uncapped since Proposal A was enacted. And we'll show what that means later when we actually show what the tax would be on that. So this home is uncapped in 2005. Timing's everything. It's a good time to get uncapped because shortly thereafter, basically, the economy pushed the value back down. So in 2004, you see that orange top, that's the untaxed value. 2005, it pops up, that untaxed value goes away, and then eventually the economy pushes that value down, and it starts to have some untaxed value again in 2012 and 13. This house uncaps several times, 3 times during this period, 2006, 2014, and 2021. So you can see what a big jump that is in taxable value between 2005 and 2006. Then the economy kind of pushes those values down. There's some untaxed value that grows during 2012 and 2013, then it uncaps in 2014, uncaps again in 2021. This property uncaps in 2007. Again, not a bad time to uncap because the economy is pushing those values down at that point. Then it uncaps again in 2010, which there was no gap between taxable value and assessed value at that time. So although the value was uncapped, there's no difference between those two numbers at that time. This property uncaps in 2016. Not a great time to uncap in terms of your tax bill. You can see from 2015 to 2016, the value went up quite a bit, and values have been continuing to go up since then. This similar story here uncaps in 2017. Values have continued to rise since then. And this property uncapped in 2021. So that's quite a fairly sizable jump, which we'll put some numbers to those shortly. Before we do that, since we're still on property values, that values times rate equals tax. So we're sticking with values now. We're going to look at some of the comparison communities. So this is taxable value by property class in 2004 with the comparison communities. So you can see the dark blue on the bottom is the residential real. That's a big part of the tax base, the majority of the tax base for almost all the communities. See, Southfield actually has quite a bit of commercial real there. You know, they've got some big office towers and stuff. Troy has some big office towers and stuff too. Not a ton of industrial in any of these communities, more in Dearborn and Sterling Heights and Livonia. Troy's got a pretty substantial chunk there too. And then the personal property. And the last one, the blue one, developmental real, we're not going to talk about it because it's not important. But it's on this chart because Novi had a little bitty bit in 2004. And if I omitted it, my chart would be incomplete. But don't worry about developmental real property. We don't need to talk about it. So this is the average of that group in 2004. You can see, you know, 60% residential, 21% commercial real. Same group, 2021. Troy's still the biggest. We'll look at change in a minute. But all of them, I think you can see how much the residential real part of the tax base really grew more than anything else. And a lot of things actually shrank. So we went from 60% residential to 67% residential on average. But this chart is really kind of interesting if you can make heads or tails of it. So let's start with Southfield. In Southfield, every class of property lost value. Residential real value went down, commercial real went down, industrial real went down, personal went down. Other end of the spectrum in Royal Oak, residential real went up, commercial real went up, personal went up, which I don't know, that's like some kind of voodoo magic because we had personal property tax reform occur during this period. So I don't know how Novi and Royal Oak actually ended up with increases, but their staff can do a presentation on that for them. We won't spend too much time on that. So again, the blue developmental real, ignore that. It only is there because Novi had a little bit and it completely went away, which is why it's big, because this is a percentage. So when you go from a number to zero, that 100% is gone. So it's kind of interesting to see what different classes of property did in different communities during this period. The good news is Troy's basically kind of the middle of the pack in terms of wins and losses, or on the total tax base. Residential taxable value in these communities in 2004, Troy's above the average. In 2021, Troy's even further above the average. You can see what happened between 2004 and 2021, like we just mentioned. Southfield lost value, Dearborn, Farmington Hills all lost. The average residential taxable value went down during that period, while in Royal Oak it increased more than 50%, Novi more than 30%, Troy 28%. So there's a lot of different things happening in these, or I guess a variety of different outcomes between 2004 and 2021. All right, so we talked about value. Let's talk about the rates. We've talked before about trying to avoid jargon and staying out of the weeds, but principal residence exemption is a piece of jargon that we all need to know and understand. It's basically your home that you live in is your principal resident, and it is exempt from 6 mills of state education tax. So if you own a vacation property, cabin in the woods up north or something like that, that's not a principal residence, you're paying 6 mills, 18 mills of state education tax on that. All the other rates are the same. So when we talk about city rates, which is really what we're most interested in, we don't have to worry about looking at two different sets of rates. So we're going to talk about rates in three different groups. One is the catch-all everything else. Troy, the city, and other cities collect taxes for everybody. And so here's a list of all the other taxing jurisdictions and authorities that the city collects taxes for. So the everything else category is everything that's not the city or school taxes. Schools, Troy, we have 7 different school districts that we collect taxes for, although you can see on the map, Troy Schools is by far the majority of the city, but we do have parts of 6 other districts within the city's corporate boundaries. And then the city rates, we've got a few. We've got the city's operating and capital rate, which are both part of the general tax provision in the city charter. It was divided between an operating millage and a capital millage by practice as far back as 1985. I didn't try to look back any further than 1985. So that's what this looks like from 1985 to 2008, when there was a new property tax limitation voters approved at that time that basically said what you're levying right now is the maximum you can levy unless voters approve something else. So since that time, the city's operating millage has been 6.5. And the capital portion has been reduced from 1.53 to 1.33 by Headley rollbacks. So the capital millage has taken all the rollbacks that have occurred, and the operating millage has stayed the same. Other tax rates that we have, we call it refuse. I like to call it garbage because that's the first word the statute uses to describe it. It's called sanitation, solid waste, rubbish, goes by many names, but it's Public Act 298 of 1917 that authorizes that particular tax. And then we have our library tax, which most recently was approved by voters in November of 2020. So this is what this city's tax rates have looked like from 2004 to 2021. And again, this is for a principal residence that's not paying that extra 18 mils. You got the school portion, you've got the everything else portion, and then the city portion. And so the city portion has gone from being the smallest portion to basically being about equivalent to the everything else portion, back to being the smallest portion again more recently. All right, sticking with tax rates, let's do some comparisons with other communities. So this is the everything else portion of the bill. From 2004, don't have good data from Wayne County, so I'm leaving Dearborn and Livonia out of this, so it doesn't mess with the averages or anything. But basically, the everything else portion, most of it is being levied at the county level. So you can see the, basically the Oakland County communities are all nearly identical. The ones on the right, Southfield, Royal Oak, Farmington Hills, and Troy, opt in to the Oakland County transportation millage, which is why they are ever so slightly higher than Novi and Rochester Hills, which do not participate in the transportation millage. And then Sterling Heights is on its own. It's the only example in Macomb County. 2021, same group of communities. I don't know what happened in Macomb County, but there everything else went up. Sterling Heights went from the lowest to the highest. Troy, Royal Oak, again, those opt-in communities, transportation opt-in communities are all the same. And then Novi and Rochester Hills are still opt-out communities. So not a lot of change from 2004 to 2021 for the Oakland County communities. There was a big change in Macomb County, but that doesn't really concern us. These are the school rates in 2004. So here again, there's more variability. Troy is right about on par with the average in 2004 and right about on par with the average in 2021. So this is interesting. The school millages actually, the school portion of the tax bill actually went down during this period of time. So here's the disclaimer. This presentation is not a school funding presentation. Schools get funding from other places. And I don't have 200 slides to devote to that tonight. So don't take any away from this particular slide any more than, you know, across the board, school millages went down. But again, schools are not as highly dependent on property taxes as cities are. City rates 2004, Troy's below the average, second lowest only to Rochester Hills, which doesn't have a sanitation millage. More on that later. And then in 2021, Troy is the lowest out of the group. So during this period of time, Troy's city rates increased 6%, where on average rates increased 43%. We'll talk more about what that means when we get to the tax portion of the equation. These are the total principal resident rates. 2004, Troy's just a little bit below the average. 2021, Troy's further below the average. So this is what happens when you put the city and the schools and everything else all back together. Again, this is the total PRE, principal resident tax rate. This is how they changed between 2004 and 2021. You can see the tax rates went down in Novi, Rochester Hills, and Troy. On average, they went up 7%. So this is interesting to me because what it shows is that between 2004 and 2021, the school portion of the tax bill and the city portion of the tax bill basically trade places. 2004, the school portion of the tax bill is the largest portion of the tax bill, and everything else is the smallest portion, and the city's in the middle. 2021, on average, the city portion of the tax bill is the biggest, and everything else is still the smallest, and the school portion of the tax bill is the medium, second largest of the three. This is what happened in Troy. It doesn't follow the same pattern. Everything else basically stayed the same. City rate increases a little bit, but it's still the smallest portion of the tax bill. I think I mentioned this at the last meeting. In 2021, there was only 3 cities in Metro Detroit where that was the case: Orchard Lake, Romulus, and Troy. I don't know what that says about the taxes in those 3 communities. Not sure what to make of it, but it's not the norm. All right, so without further ado, let's take values and tax rates and talk about taxes. So this is the average Troy tax bill. See the school portion, the city portion, and the everything else portion. So we go from a total tax bill of about $3,700 to 2004. We're up to about $4,700 in 2021. Again, that's the average. Let's look at some real examples in order to understand the effects of capping and uncapping. So this is that house on Whisper Way that's been kept since 1994. And this is the house on Foxcroft that's been taxed since 1994. Again, here taxes are a little bit above the average, these are taxes a little bit below the average. What would have happened if they would have uncapped in 2021? This didn't actually happen, it's for illustrative purposes only, but the new owner of Whisper Way would have seen a 32% tax increase. $1,800 a year, that's about $150 a month. It's not a car payment. It's less than some people pay for cable, but it's not nothing. And then the house on Foxcroft would have been a 53% increase, which is actually a smaller dollar amount, but as a percent increase is even more. So let's look at some things that actually happened. So Diamond, I mentioned 2005 was a good time to get uncapped because the market was pushing values down. So here, the tax bill didn't actually go up very much when it was uncapped. Timberwick Trail, this you can see a 48% increase when that house uncapped in 2006, $183 a month. Parkview uncapped in 2007, only a 12% increase because it was 2007, so the market was pushing values down. It uncapped again in 2010, and it was only a 7% increase because again, the market was still pushing values down. So, good time to buy a house and capture taxable value while it's low. 2014, that train has left the station and now we're looking at increases again. 35% increase when this property uncapped in 2014. This house uncaps in 2016, and you can see it was already quite a bit above the average tax bill, and it goes from about $7,300 a year to $9,900 a year, $2,017 a month, and that is it's not more than my car payment. I take that back. This property uncaps in 2017, similar results, 49% increase. Oakwood uncaps 2021, 31% increase. Everybody get the idea so far? Okay, timing's everything. This property uncaps in 2021 only increases 8% because it had uncapped fairly recently before that, I think. But anyway, make sure we... Okay, we're making good time, right?
It's all relative.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to talk about property taxes in comparisons to the other communities. This is the everything else portion of the tax bill. Again, I don't have good data for Wayne County, so I've left Dearborn and Livonia out of these calculations. You can see in 2004, the everything else portion, the average was $887. Troy was $1,059. This is primarily because of the values in Troy are higher. We know that the taxpayers in Troy, Southfield, Royal Oak, Farmington Hills, they're paying the same rates, but this is a case where the value makes a big difference. So this is what people are actually paying. Similar in 2021, the everything else portion of the tax bill in Troy is $1,400. It's above the average, even though folks are paying the same rate as Southfield, Royal Oak, Farmington Hills, but the average value in Troy is higher, so the average tax bill is higher. So this is how the everything else portion of the tax bill changed. For these, I put inflation on the chart just to kind of show what was happening overall during that period of time. So the everything else portion of the tax bill increases 23% on average. It increases 33% here in Troy, which is still less than 45% that inflation grew during that time. This is the school tax portion of the tax bill, 2004. You see Troy's above the average. And in 2012, Troy's still above the average. You can see how there's some trading places happening. Novi's the highest in both 2004 and 2021, but you can see Farmington Hills and Troy trade places there. And then again, overall, school taxes in Southfield and Farmington Hills and Rochester Hills actually went down, which in the case of Southfield and Farmington Hills, you'll recall values went down during that time, so rates could have been either staying the same or maybe even increased a little bit. But on average, it was 2% and Troy was 15% and inflation was 45%. Again, this is interesting only to the extent that it tells us what was happening with tax bills, not what was happening with school funding in general. City taxes, the part of the tax bill the city actually controls and gets to keep. In 2004, Troy was just right on par with the average. 2021, fallen below the average, but still more than Livonia and Sterling Heights. Then you can see the change between 2004 and 2021. Livonia, Southfield, Novi, Rochester Hills, all below 40%. Troy's at 36. Inflation was 45. And the average increase in the city tax portion of the bill was 52%, driven in large part by Royal Oak. And the increase in Royal Oak is driven in large part by the increase in values. Because back to that, one of the earlier slides where Royal Oak was all the way over on the right because it had the most tax-based growth during that period. So we'll kind of get into dissecting the rates a little bit. Rates have gone up in Royal Oak too, but a lot of that's driven by values. Total principal resident taxes, 2004, Troy's above average at 3713. 2021, Troy's a little bit below average at 4,000. Again, that's the total tax bill. Or, I'm sorry, Troy's above average at 4,662. The average is 4,010. But that's driven in large part by the school portion of the tax bill, which is the largest portion of the tax bill. And this is how tax bills change. Total PRE taxes between 2004 and 2021. Average grew 22%. Troy grew 26%. Inflation was 45%. So, conclusions. Somebody asked, or I can't let you all go without saying a little bit about Proposal A. So we've talked about capping and uncapping. Well, Proposal A is why that happens. So that's the jargon. I think thus far, we've explained what happens without getting too far in the weeds, but shout out to Proposal A. That's what makes that happen. And then we know that Headley creates rollbacks and tax rates and that sort of thing, but this is one thing, like if you only take one thing away from the hundreds of slides, let it be this.
Well, I'm going to write this down.
Let it be this. Because I have heard people who ought to know better say things that are not true as it relates to Headley. So we talked about all those properties where the tax bill increased by 50% or it increased by 7% or 8%. And that taxpayer is probably like, wow, city, you're really riding, you should be in great financial shape. I'm paying you more than the previous property owner paid. If only that were true, Madam Taxpayer, the city doesn't get to keep that. There's no windfall. That drives the millage rate down. So while your taxes have gone up 50%, you're helping finance a tax cut, a tax rate rollback for all your neighbors. So welcome, neighbor. The more new residents who move in, the more the existing residents benefit. The city does not benefit. The city rolls the millage rate back. So having everybody in Troy sell their property and uncap is not a solution to a financial problem. It just rolled the tax rate back further. So, if only one thing, understand that part. Existing homeowners enjoy the benefits of that capping and uncapping and rolling back. And when moving means trading in a capped taxable value for a new taxable value that's 40-50% greater, that creates a big disincentive to moving. It's also a huge equity issue. And like I said, we're back to the difference between taxable value and assessed value is larger now than it was before the recession. It was kind of becoming a thing before the recession. There was talk at the state level of like, oh my gosh, maybe we should do something about this because we've, got such inequity among taxpayers. But then the Great Recession wiped that all away and it wasn't a problem anymore. Well, now we're back to pre-recession levels of inequity. Unfortunately, nothing we can do as a city of Troy. That's state law, not just state law, but it's state constitution. So on the everything else portion of the tax bill, on average, increased 23%, Troy's increased 33%. On the PRE schools portion of the tax bill is basically flat. Troy had increased 15%. And then the city tax portion of the bill, on average, increased 52%. Troy's increased 36%. So the total tax bill increased by 22% on average, 26% in Troy, which is a little bit above the average, but again, that's mostly due to the school portion of the tax bill. So I'll pause. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and show you the other few slides because
So I felt a little shortchanged with the first presentation.
This was something that specifically came up at the last meeting. People said they wanted to see. It took more time to collect the data. My thanks to Meg from the manager's office for helping. And this data is not perfect. So I'll tell you how I've simplified it. Same comparison communities, no changes there. So I told you a little bit about types of property, personal property, real property. Well, we actually got different types of tax rates as well. Different sources. You've got rates that are authorized by city charters. You've got rates that are authorized by statute. And then you've got rates that are authorized by voters. Lots of different purposes for millages. General government, everybody's got one. All 9 cities in the group. Library, second most popular answer on the board. Police and fire, we talked about that a little bit. 7 out of the 9 communities have a police and or fire millage. 7 have that garbage millage. 7 have a parks and or recreation millage. Roads and or streets are popular. And I'll explain the one called advertising, because that's another, nobody calls it advertising, but that's what the statute calls it, among other things. So the type of authorization that a levy might have is limited, which means it's subject to Headley rollbacks. Unlimited authorization, this means it's not limited to Headley rollbacks, and there's not a lot of those. There's debt millages and police and fire pension millages. Some tax rates have an expiration date. Troy had, first library millage was 5 years, second library millage was 5 years, current library millage is 10 years. You can also have a millage that goes on in perpetuity. So this is the Garbage Act, goes by many names. Public Act 298 of 1917, the legislative body can levy up to 3 mills without voter approval. It's one of the few taxes that doesn't have to go to a vote of the people to be approved. And 7 out of the 9 communities in the group have this. Rochester Hills does not, Novi does not. So those costs are paid outside the tax bill. But they still pick up the trash in those communities. They just don't do it through the tax bill. Advertising, this is an Act 359 of 1925. Allows the governing body to levy up to 4 mills, but you can't collect more than $50,000. So this millage in a large community, the millage is like 0.0125. It's a very small millage, but it's popular because it can be levied without a vote of the people. So 5 out of the 9 in the group have that.
That's $50,000 in 1925 dollars?
Well, it's no adjustment for inflation. It's $50,000 every year. So it's popular, but it doesn't generate a lot of money. Drain debt, I don't know anything about drain debt. All I know is that there's a lot of communities that have it, and but Troy isn't one of them. Police and fire pension, this is authorized by Act 345 of 1937. There's only 2 cities in the group that have this. This, I affectionately refer to it as a license to print money, because basically, like, whatever amount of money you have to spend on police and fire pensions, you just levy a millage to generate that amount. It could be 0 one year or 10 mils the next year, and them's the breaks. Probably one of the reasons why it's not terribly popular. A lot of communities don't have it, and but it shows up, so I thought you ought to know. So in this period of time, we're looking at 2012. I can't go back as far as in time and get this information with any reliability. So in 2012, Troy had 5 millages on average. This group had 8 millages. And you can't blame Stephanie for any of the color choices in this in these slides, because I created them today, and I asked her not to bother with the changing the colors to match the other slides. In 2021, you can see Troy still got 5, but the average has gone up from 8 to 9. So this is an oversimplification of the tax rates that Dearborn taxpayers paid between 2012 and 2021. And I say oversimplification because the last category is everything else. So there's just a bunch of other stuff that I lumped together. But you can see here the general levy is the largest. They've got a library levy. They've got a debt levy, which is it's for their combined stormwater overflow system. They're a combined sewer system community that's got to retrofit and separate, spending lots and lots of money on that. They also use the Garbage Act, and then there's the everything else portion of the tax bill. So Dearborn, fairly straightforward. Farmington Hills, again, got a general levy, got a library levy. The library in Farmington is a district library, different statutory authority. Didn't bother to explain that statute in the final cut here, but you can see the yellow portion is a police and or fire millages, and I say all sources in parentheses because some of the communities have voted millages and some of them have police and or fire millages actually in their city charters. But for these purposes, we don't really care where the authority is, if it's voter or charter. Farmington Hills is using the Garbage Act. They've got a Parks and or Recreation millage. Roads and Streets, which is another popular one. And then they've got that Advertising Act, which is itty bitty little levy, so you can't even really see it. Livonia's got more millage rates than you can shake a stick at. The general charter levy is less than 5 mils. It's very small. They actually have more voted millages than they have charter millages. But they have a library millage, libraries plural. I think they have more than one library still. They've got some police and fire millages. I think it's like 3, which I've basically kind of rolled into one here for ease. The Garbage Act, they've got Parks and Recreation. They also use the Advertising Act. And they've got a fair amount of everything else. They have a recycling millage. They have a millage that it's about streets and trees, and another one that's seniors and stuff. A lot of different millages. Novi. This Novi is interesting because you can't really see it, but the advertising Act 359, they didn't levy it in 2012. That was something that they added later on. But you can see general millage, library millage. They've got some debt. Police and fire, parks and rec, roads and streets, and this is one of the communities which I think is using drain debt under Act 40 of 1956, but we won't try to go too far in the weeds with them. Rochester Hills, big yellow bar, big. They've got a fire millage in their charter. They've got 2 different voted police millages. So you can see how over this period of time the general levy has actually shrank and the police and fire millages increased. They've got library millage, debt millage, road and streets, parks and rec, some drain debt, and a little bit of everything else, which is like OPC, Older Persons Commission, and OPC Transportation, just as examples. Royal Oak City rates, general, library, got some debt, police and or fire, using the Garbage Act, got some streets and or roads, they're using the Advertising Act, some drain debt, and there's some everything else in there too. Southfield's an interesting one because all of Southfield's millages fit neatly into the categories that I picked. There's no everything else. They have a general, library, debt, police and or fire, garbage, parks and rec, roads and streets, advertising, drain debt, and then they have that police and fire pension, which coincidentally, so does Sterling Heights. So if your city starts with an S, I guess, because St. Clair Shores has one too, I think. So I guess, you know. So you see Sterling Heights, much different than some of the others. Much bigger general levy, little bit of debt. They're using the Garbage Act. They've got parks, I think it's actually a recreation millage. They're using some drain debt. They've got that Police and Fire Pension Act. And then the only thing that would fit into the everything else category is what they call their Safe Streets millage. So I just put Safe Streets on there, and for simplicity's sake. And that includes some public safety and roads and or streets, I should say. So that's what Sterling Heights rates look like. And that is all 120 slides.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. Not sure what you're going to do now for the next several weeks without any special meetings to make slides for, but
Taking a vacation.
he's just kidding. I appreciate, and we all do, obviously, all this information. I know it's, at least for me, a lot to kind of absorb. Even having these in advance, it's still a lot to kind of work through. But because of where we're at in time, I'm not going to go around the table, but I'm not going to stop anybody from saying anything, obviously, or asking any questions. So if there's any, maybe we can keep some of the editorial comments out if we have the actual questions that need to be asked. That might be the best thing. So anyone want to ask a question or make a short statement? Rebecca?
I'll start, because actually it goes back to your one thing, Bob, from the previous presentation on slide 95. So actually had this very conversation with my father last night, and I wish I had gotten to fly 95 before I talked to Dad, but I hadn't gotten there. It was like midway through. Dad calls, I'm like, don't pick up the phone. I'm reading my council agenda packet, and we were talking about, Troy, and I was talking about this, what I'm reading, and then the great news this week of our schools, being ranked in the top 10, Troy High, number 2. And my dad made a comment along the lines of this, saying, oh, well, maybe the downside of your amazing schools and Troy being such a great community is, people buy homes and they stay, and you don't have this uncapping. And kind of, that's the problem. You don't have an uncapping. And so, but what you're saying is, no, actually, that is not true. Dad was wrong. Because
Sorry,
even
Dad.
Dad's wrong. Even if you have an uncapping, you're going to take a hit with Headley. And is that, the question then, is that because, what is it with Headley, the growth that you have from all the uncapping is greater than the rate of inflation, and that's what caused the rollback?
Right, yeah, under Headley, uncapping is not considered a Headley addition. It's not new tax base, and so it causes the rollback.
Okay, and then if it's additional development, is that part of, if that is included with that, does that also affect that potentially if you do have a lot of uncapping and you have new development, which is sort of, it's a, I don't know if you say it's not really an uncapping, it's just a new.
No, brand new development, when it comes on the tax roll, it's a Headley addition.
Okay.
And that's another thing we'll get to eventually, is that for all the attention that development gets in Troy, it is a very small drop in a very large bucket. The city's, most of its development occurred in the 70s, and so the new developments that are being built, that's great that we're still adding to the tax base, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not generating a ton of revenue for the city.
Okay, that's incredibly helpful. And then just one small little clarification. I don't know if I've asked this before. With the principal residence exemption, I always just call that being homesteaded. Does that apply? I know commercial properties are not homesteaded, they're not a principal residence, but do they pay that full 18 mills?
Yes.
They do, okay. That's it.
Yeah, and it used to be called the homestead exemption. The statute, they changed the name a while back.
Oh, wait, one more, can I ask one more quick question? So with the uncapping, essentially that is the February, your Valentine's bill that you get after you buy your home. Is that? So I'm trying to think, we bought our home in 2016, but I saw my uncapping was 2017. So
Yeah,
is
the
that February
uncapping
assessment?
occurs the year after, right?
And that's the
Yeah.
assessment, the new bill you get every, the Valentine's bill.
That is not a bill.
Well, I'm sorry, not a bill, not a bill.
Yeah, that's the value.
The value,
Yeah.
not an announcement, or.
Yep.
What is the proper term for it?
Notice of assessment.
Notice of
Yeah.
assessment. I did want to give a shout out to Troy. So I was a global, kind of a globe trotter, finally settled down. We chose Troy. I remember when you're trying to figure out, am I going to buy this, this home, and you have the mortgage lender will kind of figure out your assessment, but it's always based on the current cap rate. And then I remember when I got that new assessment, I was like, what's going on? And the mortgage company actually called the city of Troy. I think it was the treasurer's office, and they did a brilliant job explaining it to me. So just a shout out to Troy. That was my first experience with the whole kind of capping, uncapping. Little did I know that's Prop A, so.
Mhm.
Good stuff. Any other questions? Edna?
So the Headley impact on Troy, how does it compare to the other comparison communities? Are we all kind of in the same boat, or some less or more impacted?
Well, if you're losing value, then Headley's not impacting you, because values can fall as fast as they want, as far as they want. So it's basically the more values are, if your values are increasing faster than the rate of inflation, then Headley is having a greater effect on you. So like we saw examples, Southfield was losing value, so Headley their rates were like flat during that whole period. There was like basically no rollbacks.
Ellie?
I have a list of the millage reduction fractions for each community in Oakland County, if that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, I just want to see where we stack
Yeah,
up.
I can forward it to Bob.
Perfect.
I thought you had it memorized. I was like, go ahead.
Probably does.
7:30 meeting maybe, Kelly.
I can forward that to Bob.
I'm still stuck on Valentine's, not a bill, but anyway, maybe we can market that a little bit. Never mind. Other questions or short comments? I have actually a question and I know someone can figure it out quicker than I can, but when I look at the Troy operating and capital tax rates, it was slide 45. So 2009 was 6.5 operating, 1.5 for the capital, and then today it's still 6.50 for operating. Now it's 1.33 because we're putting our heavily on the capital. What's the actual dollar? What's that equal to? So that 0.2 reduction in capital, how much money are we down this year? Roughly. I bet Rob maybe knows, or somebody might.
No, I
Or do you
can
know?
look it up. I mean, basically, you take the city's total taxable value, divide it by 1,000 and multiply it by that number.
Hamilton probably knows.
5 million.
I'm just
Yeah.
curious
Yeah.
what that is. I mean, because that obviously is of interest to me anyway.
Yeah.
Okay. Just curious what that might, how that equates.
It's a fire truck.
Interesting. Anything else, Ellen?
You know these that you broke down for each city?
Mhm.
We have that in our budget, I know, but could we have one,
For Troy?
have that sent just for Troy
Yeah,
in the stack, you know,
Mhm.
to add to it? Could you email that to us, that would be great.
sure.
All right. Well, obviously, okay, so about 6 weeks from now, we have our advance,
Mhm.
right? And we've done our educational study sessions up until now. I don't think we have anything more scheduled other than regular meetings.
Correct.
Anything you or Mark, if he was here, would, want us to know or have to think about from this standpoint leading up to that?
I think, you made a good point. It's a lot to digest. So hopefully if anybody has questions or wants more information, let us know, send an email, and we'll get the information together and distribute it through the normal channels. Mark and I are meeting with our facilitator, James Vitrano, basically on a weekly basis right now, kind of prepping for the advance. And so if you have questions or comments, they could be things that it's just asked and answered, or it could be something like, oh, that really needs to be dealt with during the advance. So continue to digest this and let us know if you have any questions or comments.
Good? All right, we have no other business on the agenda this evening, so we'll be adjourned.